The sun rose slow and heavy over the small southern town, its light cutting through the blinds of Malcolm Davis's modest home. The walls carried the faint smell of yesterday's cooking, collard greens and cornbread that had lingered into the morning. Malcolm sat at the kitchen table, coffee steaming in his favorite chipped mug, the one Amara had painted for him years ago in art class. His daughter shuffled in, still wrapped in the blanket she'd fallen asleep with on the couch. She was 15, lanky and sharp-eyed, a mix of her father's steady gaze and her mother's playful smile. "Daddy, you're already up?" she asked, yawning, reaching for an apple from the counter. "Always," he replied softly, the corner of his mouth tilting upward. "The world don't slow down just because we want a little more sleep." She rolled her eyes but smiled, sliding into the chair across from him. For a moment, there was peace between them, the kind that lives only in a house where love has had to make itself louder than grief. After breakfast, Malcolm carried his pressed shirt over his arm. He ironed with care, each crease a small ritual of discipline and dignity. Driving wasn't glamorous, not in a town like this, but he wore his clothes as though he were stepping into a boardroom. To him, respect began with how he carried himself. The house told its own story. Family photos lined the walls, his late wife's smile in every one. On the shelf sat a box, unassuming, covered with folded flag, military medals, and papers bound in neat stacks. Few ever knew what rested inside. To most, Malcolm was just another man who drove people where they needed to go. But the truth, sealed inside that box, whispered a past that stretched far beyond the cracked sidewalks of this town. By mid-morning, he was outside, greeting neighbors with a quiet nod. Mrs. Holloway, who lived across the street, leaned on her cane and called, "Morning, Malcolm. Tell that daughter of yours she still owes me a chess game." "I'll remind her," he said, helping her balance her grocery bag. People here trusted him. Some even leaned on him, though they never saw the weight he carried himself. Before heading to work, he stopped by the community center. The children lit up when they saw him. Malcolm coached them in chess and debate, teaching not just strategies on a board, but the discipline of patience and restraint. He believed deeply in giving them what the world might never willingly offer, the knowledge that they mattered. By the time he climbed into his car for work, a well-kept sedan he polished every Sunday, the sun had risen fully. The town buzzed with routine, white picket fences tended on one side, crumbling porches on the other. He saw the differences every day, yet he drove through it all with the same steady hands on the wheel. As the radio played softly, an old gospel hymn, Malcolm's mind drifted to Amara's future. He thought of her walking through doors no one had ever opened for him. That was what he worked for, every long hour, every unkind word he let pass without reply. Not for himself, but for the promise that she wouldn't have to fight the same battles. And still, even in that quiet car, there were moments when the ache of the past pressed heavy on his chest. His wife's absence, the years of silence he'd endured in rooms where his intelligence was underestimated, the injustice woven into the very streets he drove. He'd learned long ago that silence was not surrender, it was strategy. And though most people mistook him for just a driver, Malcolm carried within him the patience of a man who knew that every role, every slight, every dismissal was part of a larger design. When Amara kissed him goodbye before school, she whispered, "Don't let nobody talk down on you today, Daddy." He smiled, brushing his hand across her shoulder gently. "Baby girl, they can talk all they want. Words can't move a man who knows where he's standing." With that, Malcolm pulled the car door shut, the hum of the engine filling the morning air. To the world outside, he was just another working man starting another working day. But beneath the quiet exterior, the story was already building towards something greater, something that would remind this town who Malcolm Davis truly was. The afternoon sun hung low, casting long shadows across the brick buildings downtown as Malcolm steered his car toward the entrance of the Hayes Building, the tallest structure in the town, its mirror glass catching the light like a jewel. It belonged to Hayes Industries, the company that employed nearly half the county and dictated, in quiet but unmistakable ways, the pace of everyone's lives. Wages, housing, even a high school sports sponsorships bore the Hayes name. Power here wasn't loud. It was inherited, folded neatly into contracts and handshakes. Malcolm parked the sedan by the curb, stepping out to open the door just as Victoria Hayes appeared. She was sharp in a cream-colored suit, her hair pulled back in a bun so tight it looked painful. The heels of her shoes clicked against the pavement like small gunshots. Two assistants flanked her, both white men in press suits, carrying tablets and whispering reminders. When her eyes landed on Malcolm, they flicked over him with the indifference of someone scanning a piece of furniture. "You the driver?" she asked, not waiting for an answer as she slid into the back seat. "Yes, ma'am," Malcolm replied calmly, steady as ever. She sighed as though even the acknowledgement required effort. "Do try not to be late. We have an event tonight. I'd rather not arrive dripping wet or disheveled because of someone else's incompetence." Her assistant smirked faintly, one leaning toward the other with a chuckle. Malcolm said nothing, only closed the door with quiet precision and circled back to the driver's seat. Malcolm parked the sedan by the curb, stepping out to open the door just as Victoria Hayes appeared. She was sharp in a cream-colored suit, her hair pulled back in a bun so tight it looked painful. The heels of her shoes clicked against the pavement like small gunshots. Two assistants flanked her, both white men in press suits, carrying tablets and whispering reminders. When her eyes landed on Malcolm, they flicked over him with the indifference of someone scanning a piece of furniture. "You're the driver?" she asked, not waiting for an answer as she slid into the back seat. "Yes, ma'am," Malcolm replied calmly, steady as ever. She sighed as though even the acknowledgement required effort. "Do try not to be late. We have an event tonight. I'd rather not arrive dripping wet or disheveled because of someone else's incompetence." Her assistant smirked faintly, one leaning toward the other with a chuckle. Malcolm said nothing, only closed the door with quiet precision and circled back to the driver's seat. The ride began with silence, the hum of the engine filling the void. Victoria glanced up from her phone every few minutes to correct Malcolm's route, though he knew the streets better than anyone. No, not this way," she snapped at one point, her voice sharp. "The GPS says the other route is faster." "Yes, ma'am," Malcolm said again, turning as instructed. Moments later, traffic stalled in a bottleneck, just as he had anticipated. She muttered under her breath about incompetence. He kept his eyes fixed on the road, his face unreadable, though in his chest there was a slow-burning ache. At the corporate gala hall, a red carpet lined the entrance. Wealthy guests emerged from black cars, their laughter and perfume mixing with the night air. Malcolm pulled to a stop. Victoria glanced at him in the rearview mirror, her eyes narrowing. "When you open the door," she said curtly, "try not to look so stiff. Smile, at least. You're representing this company, whether you like it or not." Malcolm stepped out, opened her door smoothly, and extended his hand. She ignored it, brushing past as though the gesture were beneath her. Guests nearby chuckled, whispering to one another. "Useless," she muttered, just loud enough for him to hear. The words sank like a stone, but Malcolm did not flinch. He closed the door, stepped back, and took his place by the car as rain clouds gathered overhead. He stood alone as the gala lights flickered on, washing the polished guests in golden glow. Inside, laughter echoed. Outside, the first drops of rain fell. Malcolm adjusted his jacket, shoulders squared, refusing the umbrella offered by a valet. His gaze stayed on the horizon. The small town sprawled out beyond the glittering hall. He thought of Amara at home, probably curled on the couch with her school books, and reminded himself why silence was sometimes the strongest reply. By the time Victoria emerged again, hours later, the rain had become a steady curtain. She waved him over impatiently. "Really? You're soaked. Standing out here like some statue," she sneered, her voice dripping with disdain. Malcolm opened the door for her again, every movement controlled, precise, refusing to give her the satisfaction of reaction. Behind his stillness, though, the storm inside him began to shift, not of anger, but of resolve. Because what Victoria Hayes did not know, what the glittering guests did not know, what even this town had long forgotten, was that Malcolm Davis was not just a driver. He was waiting, watching, preparing. And soon, the same door she mocked him outside would open wide, not for her, but for him. The ballroom glowed with chandeliers that cast a golden haze over polished marble floors. Waiters in crisp black uniforms weaved between clusters of guests, balancing trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. A string quartet played softly in the corner, its notes straining to be heard over the tide of voices. laughter that rose and swelled like a wave of privilege. Outside, Malcolm guided the sedan into the private parking line, easing it into its place among luxury cars far newer than his carefully maintained vehicle. His suit jacket, damp from the rain, clung to his shoulders. He waited, standing discreetly near the cars other drivers gathered in small clusters, smoking, trading stories, invisible to the ones inside. He kept his distance, the quiet sentinel he had always been. Inside, Victoria Hayes made her entrance, like a queen presiding over her court. Heads turned, smiles tightened. She moved through the crowd with an ease born of generations of ownership, her father's name etched into every brick of this building. She enjoyed telling the story, how her family had built this town. And then, just as the speeches began, she saw an opportunity. At the end of the evening, rain still streaking down the windows, she summoned Malcolm into the hall. He entered quietly, keeping to the edges of the opulence, head slightly bowed but not broken. Gasps rippled among guests as they realized the driver had been called inside. Victoria, champagne glass in hand, smirked at the sight of him. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced loudly, the champagne giving her voice a sharper edge, "this is our driver. Malcolm, is it?" He nodded, eyes steady. "He's been adequate," she continued, the laughter in her throat bubbling just beneath the surface. "Though I do believe he has a particular gift for getting lost and looking terribly serious while doing so. Tell me, Malcolm, do you ever smile? Or is that too much effort?" A few guests chuckled politely. Others shifted uncomfortably, but no one interrupted. Malcolm stood still, absorbing each word without a flicker. "You see," she said, lifting her glass higher, "sometimes a company hires, well, the less polished to do the more menial work. It's part of our community service, I suppose." Her friends laughed then, bolder, relieved to have permission. "And yet," she added, tilting her head as though examining a museum piece, "I can't help but wonder if perhaps some people were simply meant to stay behind the wheel. Not everyone is cut out for greatness, after all." The laughter swelled, bouncing against the crystal chandeliers. Malcolm's hands rested calmly at his sides, his breathing steady. His eyes moved across the room, not with shame, but with a kind of patience that unsettled a few who looked long enough to notice it. When she was done, she dismissed him with a wave of her hand, like a servant dismissed from the stage. "Back to the car now, won't you? We'll be needing you when this is over. Try not to get wet this time." The room erupted again, and he turned without a word. He walked out through the crowd, every step unhurried, as if the ridicule slid off him like rain against glass. Some guests looked at him with pity. A handful looked away, unable to meet his gaze. Back outside, the night had deepened into a steady storm. Malcolm stood in the rain again, leaning against the car. His jacket was soaked through, his hands cold. But his expression, unchanged, unbroken, carried something else now. Because while Victoria Hayes and her circle laughed, while the room believed the joke had landed, Malcolm knew something they did not. He knew the weight of the papers locked in his briefcase at home. He knew the signatures inked, the deals finalized, the quiet strategy years in the making. He knew that this humiliation was temporary, a scene playing out before a turn no one in that room could imagine. And as the gala wound down, as glasses clinked and guests planned their drive back to mansions on a hill, Malcolm remained in the rain, silent, steady, waiting. The gala was still humming when Malcolm re-entered the building. The rain had slowed outside, leaving droplets clinging to the glass doors, catching the light like fractured stars. He had changed in the car, pulling a garment bag from the trunk. Now he wore a tailored navy suit, cut to fit with understated precision, his tie knotted neatly at the collar. Gone was the damp jacket of a driver waiting in the rain. He walked with a different rhythm now, the kind that made people part without knowing why. Inside, Victoria Hayes was mid-conversation with a group of investors, her laugh cutting through the din of clinking glasses. Her assistants hovered close, collecting names and handshakes. But as Malcolm entered, a ripple went through the room. At first it was curiosity, guests whispering, eyes narrowing, trying to place him. He didn't rush. His stride was calm, unhurried, but each step rang with certainty. The board chairman, an older gentleman with silver hair and a commanding voice, tapped his glass. The room fell quiet. "Ladies and gentlemen, "If I may have your attention," he began. His tone carried the weight of formality, the promise of an announcement. Tonight is not only a celebration of Hayes Industries' continued success, but also a new chapter in its leadership. Victoria's face lit with expectation. She smoothed her suit jacket and positioned herself at the center, ready to accept praise she was certain was hers. The chairman continued, gesturing toward Malcolm. "It is my honor to introduce the man who will be guiding this company into its next era of integrity and progress. Mr. Malcolm Davis, the newly appointed Chief Executive Officer." The silence that followed was electric, thick enough to stop the air itself. Glasses froze midair. Faces twisted in disbelief. Then came the whispers, sharp and hurried, spreading to the ballroom like fire. Victoria's smile collapsed into confusion, then horror. She glanced from the chairman to Malcolm, searching for some mistake, some cruel joke. But there he was, standing taller now, his gaze steady, his presence undeniable. Malcolm approached the podium, his footsteps measured. He looked out over the crowd, his eyes sweeping across faces that only moments ago had laughed at his humiliation. He did not rush. He allowed the weight of the moment to settle, the discomfort to thicken until it was unbearable. Then he began, his voice calm, resonant. "Good evening. Some of you may recognize me as the man who drove you here tonight. Some of you may not have seen me at all, but I assure you I have seen you." His words cut to the air, unshaken, deliberate. "I have seen how our workers labor without recognition, how neighborhoods are left behind, how people are measured by the thickness of their wallets or the color of their skin rather than the depth of their dignity." There was a murmur in the crowd, uneasy, restless, but no one interrupted. "For years, I worked quietly. I invested, I strategized, and I waited. Not because I wanted revenge," he continued, his eyes finding Victoria briefly, "but because I wanted change, true change. This company was built on the backs of people who were never invited into this ballroom, and that ends tonight." Victoria shifted uncomfortably, her assistants whispering furiously into their phones. The cameras, once idly capturing the evening, now pointed directly at Malcolm, documenting every word. "I stand before you not as your driver, but as the man entrusted with this company's future. And my first promise to you is simple. No one who works under this name will ever be called useless again." The room broke into applause, hesitant at first, then swelling. Some clapped out of respect, others out of shock, but the momentum grew. Victoria's face flushed red, her grip tightening around her glass until it cracked faintly. Malcolm stepped back from the podium, letting the applause echo. He didn't smile, didn't gloat. His composure remained intact, the same calm patience he had carried in the rain. But now the balance had shifted. The man they had mocked was no longer invisible. He was the center, an entire room. Every chandelier, every polished surface, every person belonged to his moment. And Victoria Hayes, for the first time in her life, realized the world she had always controlled was slipping out her hands. By morning, the footage was everywhere. Someone had recorded it. Malcolm's walk to the podium, Victoria's frozen expression, his voice steady as he declared no one would be called useless again. It spread first on local feeds, then jumped to national outlets. The clip was shared with captions like, "The driver who became CEO," and "Dignity speaks louder than power." At the corner cafe, older black men gathered around a small television, coffee cups forgotten as they watched the replay. One leaned forward, eyes wide, whispering, "That's Malcolm. That's our Malcolm." A murmur of pride filled the air, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others with tears sliding silently down their cheeks. In the barber shop, young boys sat on the cracked leather chairs while their uncles and cousins debated loudly. "You see the way he stood there? Calm, not even flinching," one said, clapping his hands together. "That's how you do it. That's how you show M who we are." Even at Amara's high school, students huddled around phones between classes. She walked down the hallway, backpack slung over one shoulder, hearing fragment of her father's speech echoing through whispered retellings. Someone called after her, "Yo, that's your dad, right? That's your dad." She didn't answer, but the small smile on her face was enough. But not everyone was celebrating. At Hayes Industries headquarters, Victoria locked herself in a conference room with lawyers and board members. "This is a mistake," she hissed, her voice shrill with desperation. "He's unqualified, But the board, wary of the cameras now fixed on every move they made, shifted uncomfortably. For once, they did not rush to her defense. The town's white elite gathered in hushed dinners and whispered about betrayal. They feared what Malcolm's leadership would mean for the old order they had grown comfortable with. Landowners, bankers, even the mayor began making calls, reaching for whatever levers of power they could still control. Meanwhile, in the neighborhoods Malcolm had quietly supported for years, hope sparked. The small community center where he taught chess filled with parents and children, everyone buzzing with pride. Old friends came by his house to leave notes. Flowers, food, gestures of thanks, and solidarity. For once, their voices felt louder than the whispers of doubt. The media descended quickly. Reporters lined his street, cameras flashing as he left for work. Microphones thrust forward with questions. "Mr. Davis, what will be your first act as CEO? Did you plan this reveal? What do you say to those who claim you tricked the board?" Malcolm answered sparingly, never raising his voice. "This isn't about me," he said once, pausing to look directly into the cameras. "This is about what people deserve. Respect, opportunity, dignity. That's all I've ever asked for, and that's what we'll build here." But the attention brought risk too. Late-night phone calls rattled his silence. Threats disguised as warnings. "Careful how you move, Davis. You're shaking foundations you don't understand." Unmarked cars lingered near his home, their headlights cutting to the dark when Amara looked out the window. She asked him one night, voice trembling, "Daddy, are we safe?" He rested a hand gently on her shoulder. "We are, baby girl, because we've got truth. And truth doesn't scare easy." In churches, sermons shifted, pastors preaching about standing firm in the storm. In union halls, workers organized, emboldened by the sight of someone who looked like them holding power in a place that had always denied it. The story of Malcolm Davis had become more than one man's rise. It was becoming a mirror that forced the town and soon the country to see its cracks, its cruelty, and its possibility for change. And in the midst of it all, Malcolm remained steady. He carried himself with the same patience he had held in the rain outside the gala, because he knew the battle was not over. In many ways, it had just begun. The air in Malcolm's new office still smelled faintly of fresh paint and old cigar smoke, a clash of eras. The room overlooked the town square, where brick sidewalks wound between monuments and fading storefronts. From this vantage point, he could see the courthouse, the church steeple, the abandoned factory that once employed hundreds of black families before being stripped bare. He stood at the window that first morning, his hand resting on the sill, watching the workers trickle into the building. They carried lunch pails, worn coats, tired faces. Many of them had walked past him 100 times without knowing his name. Now they looked up at the corner office, waiting for a sign that anything would be different. The first sign came swiftly. Malcolm called a meeting with the department heads. They entered warily, still uncertain if this new CEO was a novelty or a threat. Victoria sat near the back, flanked by her allies, her smile thin and sharp as glass. "I've spent enough years in silence," Malcolm began, his voice even, steady. "But this company has thrived on that silence, on people not asking why. Why black neighborhoods stay underfunded, while bonuses climb. Why women work twice as hard for half the recognition. Why the same families keep their names on every building while others are told to be grateful for scraps." The room shifted uncomfortably. One man cleared his throat as if to speak, but Malcolm raised a hand, silencing him without anger. "I didn't come here to play at power. I came here to put things right. And the first step is transparency. Effective immediately, every department will undergo a full audit. Payroll, hiring practices, safety standards. If you've cut corners, if you've discriminated, if you've built your wealth on anyone's back, you will answer for it." Gasps flickered through the room. Victoria leaned forward, venom in her voice. "You'll bankrupt us before you've even learned the ropes. This company doesn't run on charity, Malcolm. It runs on profit." He turned his gaze to her, calm but unflinching. "Profit without justice is theft. And I don't run from thieves. I expose them." The tension was palpable. Some of the executives exchanged looks, weighing their loyalties. A few nodded slightly, recognizing perhaps for the first time that the winds had shifted. The audits began that week. Boxes of documents were pulled from storage, files spread across tables, lawyers and young accountants poring over every line. Malcolm worked long hours beside them, sleeves rolled up, his presence both guiding and protective. He knew what they were looking for. He had spent years gathering whispers, receipts, and quiet testimony from workers too afraid to speak aloud. The results were damning. Records showed discriminatory hiring quotas. Contracts funneled to friends of board members. Safety violations buried after accidents that had left workers crippled. Entire neighborhoods had been denied loans while company executives built second homes by the lake. When the findings hit the press, the reaction was explosive. Workers staged walkouts. Families of those injured in the factories demanded compensation. Civil rights attorneys from Atlanta and D.C. called Malcolm directly, offering their support. The story spread beyond the town now, into national papers and late-night talk shows. Victoria fought back, calling him a liar and opportunist, even a traitor to the company she claimed her family had built. She appeared on television with her polished smile, insisting Malcolm was manipulating the narrative. But each denial only deepened the damage as documents surfaced, signed by her, dated undeniable. At night, Malcolm sat with Amara in their living room. Papers spread across the coffee table. "You're really doing this," she said quietly, awe and fear mingling in her voice. "We're doing this," he corrected gently, "because this isn't just about me. It's about you and every child in this town who deserves more than what they've been given." But he also knew the risks. Friends called to warn him of backroom deals, of officials plotting ways to undermine him. Anonymous notes arrived at his office, scrawled with threats. The mayor requested a private meeting. Thinly veiled intimidation wrapped in polite words. Still, Malcolm never wavered. He relied not on anger, but on patience and precision. Every move he made was deliberate, calculated. He wasn't just challenging a woman who had mocked him. He was dismantling an entire system that had thrived on humiliation. And as the audits turned into lawsuits, as headlines screamed of corruption in Hayes Industries, the stage was set for something larger, something that would drag the truth into the light for all to see. The courthouse was packed to its walls, every seat taken, every aisle crowded with people leaning against the wooden panels just to catch a glimpse of what was unfolding. Reporters lined the back, their cameras trained on the long mahogany table at the front. Outside, chants rose from a swelling crowd. Workers, families, students, holding handmade signs that read "Justice for Us" and "Respect is not optional." Inside, the air was thick with anticipation. On one side sat Malcolm, his suit immaculate, hands folded calmly on the table before him. Beside him, a team of civil rights attorneys flipped through binders and organized documents. On the other side, Victoria Hayes sat rigid, her once unshakable poise fraying at the edges. Her lawyers shuffled nervously, whispering frantically as the judge entered. When the proceedings began, the judge's gavel echoed like thunder. "We are here to address the allegations of systemic fraud, discriminatory practices, and abuse of power within Hayes Industries." The words hung heavy in the air, a declaration that this was no longer just rumor or whispers in the community. It was truth under oath. The lawyers presented the evidence one by one. Payroll discrepancies, emails dismissing qualified black candidates, reports of workplace accidents buried under falsified documents. Each file was projected onto a screen for the entire courtroom to see. Every page bore the signatures of board members, some even Victoria's own. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some people wept quietly, seeing the names of loved ones lost in accidents that could have been prevented. Others clenched their fists, anger simmering but restrained. When it was Malcolm's turn to speak, he rose slowly. The courtroom stilled. His voice carried, steady and resonant, each word measured like a stone placed carefully into history. For years, this company has taken from the very people who built it. It has treated workers as disposable, neighborhoods as irrelevant, and lives as numbers to be hidden in ledgers. I know this because I lived it. I drove past mansions while families I loved couldn't afford groceries. I heard the laughter at galas while my neighbors buried their sons from factory floors. He paused, his eyes scanning the room. Workers, reporters, the mayor sitting stiffly near the back. Last week, A woman called me useless. She mocked me for standing in the rain. She thought I was invisible. And maybe for a long time, I was. But let me tell you something. There is no such thing as a useless man. There is no such thing as a useless woman. There are only people this system refuses to see. The words hit like a wave. The room murmured, voices rising, the energy shifting. Even the judge leaned forward, listening closely. Victoria leapt to her feet, her voice sharp and desperate. This is ridiculous. He's turning this into a circus. He's a driver, not a leader. He doesn't understand what it takes to run a company. Malcolm turned his gaze to her, his composure unshaken. I understand enough to know that leadership is not about titles or bloodlines. It's about service, about responsibility, and about truth, things you abandoned a long time ago. She faltered, her words caught in her throat. The silence after his response was deafening. Then one of the attorneys presented the final blow. Video testimony from workers recorded over the past week. An older black woman appeared on the screen, her voice trembling but resolute as she recounted being denied promotions for decades. A young man, his arm still in a cast, described being told to keep quiet after an accident nearly took his life. Story after story filled the room, undeniable, unignorable. By the time the last testimony ended, Victoria sat motionless, her face pale, the walls of her power closing in. The judge looked over the evidence, then at the sea of faces in the room. Hayes Industries will be placed under immediate oversight. He declared firmly, all discriminatory practices are to cease, effective today. Further, charges of fraud and negligence will proceed to criminal court. The gavel struck again and the room erupted. Some cried, some clapped, others simply stood in stunned silence. Reporters rushed to capture Malcolm as he stepped away from the table, his expression steady, his hands clasped behind his back. He hadn't shouted, hadn't raged. He had simply spoken truth, and truth had done the rest. As he exited the courthouse, the chants outside grew louder, the crowd parting as he and Amara walked down the steps together. She slipped her hand into his, her grip tight, her eyes wide with pride. Cameras flashed, microphones extended, but in that moment Malcolm didn't see them. He saw only the faces of his people. Faces that, for the first time, looked not weary but hopeful. But for Malcolm, the transformation wasn't about the building or the board. It was about the people. On a Saturday morning, he returned to the neighborhood where he grew up, his old shoes crunching against cracked pavement he had once run across as a boy. Children were laughing on stoops, chalk drawings stretched across sidewalks, and the aroma of frying catfish drifted from porches. Neighbors waved, some clapping him on the back, others simply nodding, their eyes wet with pride. Miss Lillian, the elder who had watched over the block for decades, pressed her weathered hand into his. "Baby, you gave us our voice back," she whispered, her eyes shimmering. "Don't you forget, though, this fight is bigger than one courtroom, bigger than one company. But you reminded us we can fight." That night, in the quiet of his home, Malcolm sat with Amara at the kitchen table. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence as she leaned across, touching his hand. "I've never seen them look at you the way they did today," she said softly. "Not as a driver, not as a CEO, but as someone who carried them with him." He nodded, the weight of it all pressing against his chest, heavier than any title. "I never wanted to be the story," he admitted. "I just wanted to make sure they were seen." Later, he stepped outside. The night air was cool, carrying the scent of wet earth after a short rain. Across the town, lights flickered on in houses, in shops, in places that had once felt suffocated by silence. He thought of the factory workers who had spoken their truth, the families who no longer felt invisible, the young ones who had watched him stand tall in the courtroom and learned something about dignity that couldn't be taught in books. It wasn't victory in the way movies promised. No marching band, no fireworks. There were still investigations, still lawsuits, still a long road of healing ahead. But something had shifted. The power that once sat in the hands of a few had cracked open, spilling into the streets where it belonged. As Malcolm closed his eyes, he remembered that moment in the rain, the day he had been called useless. He let the memory play back, not with bitterness, but with a strange sense of gratitude, because that humiliation had been the spark. That word meant to diminish him, had ignited a fire that spread beyond him, beyond the boardroom, beyond the courthouse. Now, standing in the still night, he whispered to himself the word reshaped, redeemed, useless. He let it linger, then shook his head, smiling faintly. No, never again. And somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang, slow, steady, like the heartbeat of a town learning how to breathe again.